Welcome to Tech Forum Online. My name is Noah Genner, and I'm the CEO of BookNet Canada, and you are watching a presentation that was originally scheduled to be given at BookNet Canada's Tech Forum in March 2020. The title of this presentation is The State of the Canadian Book Industry, and the purpose of the presentation is to share with you the latest statistics on Canadian book buying, reading, and consumer habits. Unfortunately, we know that things have changed dramatically over the last few weeks for everyone in the book business and for everyone at large. So what we're going to do here is share data that we've collected over the last year, mostly through 2019. That was the original intention of the presentation, and we'll try where we can to give you an idea of what the industry was looking like before the latest upheaval. It is our plan over the next few weeks and few months to share more data on the changes that are happening because of COVID-19, but as that is just a recent occurrence, we don't have a lot of data on that yet, but we will be collecting data and sharing it as we can, so we urge you to stay tuned to our social channels, our website, and our blog, and to subscribe to our newsletter. So with all that in view, let's begin. So research and education is one of the key areas of BookNet's products and services ecosystem. We aim to provide the book industry with data, insight, and knowledge on the workings of the consumer and the book industry at large in Canada. Where does our data come from? Well, we collect data from a multiple variety of sources. We get data from the bibliographic data that publishers send to us. We collect data from our sales data service, which collects POS data from thousands of retailers across the country every week. We are now collecting library circulation data from public libraries weekly. We also capture data on consumer behavior from our consumer surveys, which are done every quarter, and we survey thousands of Canadian consumers every quarter on their book buying and book use and book purchasing habits. We also survey yearly Canadian book readers on how they spend their leisure time and how they read and what they read, and we make that available. And then from time to time we do ad hoc surveying of both the industry and of Canadian book readers and book buyers. So that includes things like ebook usage or audiobook use, or we survey bookstores and we survey publishers about their feelings on the industry and what they see changing. So we gather a lot of different information. We tend to combine this information whenever we can to get a better view of the industry at large. We do a lot of our surveying online, so we can get some survey bias. It's just something to be aware of. We try and account for that whenever we can. And so what we're going to do here is kind of pull a little bit from each of these areas to share with you today. So I'm going to start with our top line number, and this is brand new data. We just got this at the end of January, so every year we survey, as is mentioned here, we survey the Canadian industry on their, or Canadians on their reading habits. So last year, 79% of adult English-speaking Canadians, that's 18 and above, told us that they read or listened to a book in the last year. I'll come back to that number in a few minutes. I think that's a pretty good number, but we can look at it in context. We collect, as is mentioned, we collect POS data from retailers from across the country, and we make that available both in our sales data product, but also in our reports and on our blog. This is an example. We had heard that houseplants, we're seeing books about houseplants, we're seeing a little bit of a boom, so we looked in the sales data, and sure enough, since the last 10 or 11 years, we've seen a steady trend, and the dotted line is the trend line in sales of houseplant books. So maybe you should be publishing houseplant books. We also look at interesting things like swear words in the title of self-help books. And what you're seeing here is the top 100 self-help titles with and without swear words, the purple being with swear words. And you can see that looks like there's a trend here of books increasing, self-help books anyway, increasing their sales with swear words in the title. So there's lots of interesting stuff like that. 14% of self-help titles have swearing in the title, but they accounted for almost 50% of the sales. And that's what you're seeing in this graph here. We also survey consumers on their book buying, as I mentioned, their book buying habits. So this is the formats purchased by our buyers in our Canadian Book Consumer Survey over the last kind of 4 or 5 years. Print purchases make up about 3/4 of all purchases, combining paperback and hardcover. Digital books, ebook, and audiobook combined account for the remaining 24% of the purchases in 2019 so far. And I'm going to come back to some of these numbers as well. So back again to that top level number of the reading and listening books in the last year for English-speaking Canadians was 79%. The Pew Research Center found that 72% of U.S. adults read at least part of one book in 2018. So we're kind of comparable there. And in 2016, Australia, the most recent stat we found, 92% of Australians read at least one book in part or full in the last year. Maybe they took part in some of the Australian Reading Hour programs. In New Zealand, 86% of adults read at least one book in full or in part in 2017. So we're similar to other English-speaking territories. There may be differences in methodology between these different studies, so that might account for the differences. And this is our year-over-year reading number for the same English-speaking Canadians, the adult English-speaking Canadians, and what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years. The reason why I've separated 2020 a little bit out from the rest of the cohort there, the rest of the years, is that we changed our methodology a bit this year. We both increased the number of responses to 1,000, and we went with a different survey provider. So doing year-over-year comparison is not perfectly scientific, but still the numbers come out relatively the same. And so we've seen a little bit of a decline just outside the margin of error for a study like this since 2014 in the number of adults that are reading or listening to a book in a year. But it's been steady over the last couple years, around 80-ish% or just under 80%. So what are they reading? Well, 96% of those people said that they read a print book last year, 61% said they read an ebook, and about 50% said they read an audiobook. And we've seen a huge growth in that audiobook number. I'm going to touch on that a little bit further along as well. And then we also ask, what do they prefer? So of those same people, 66% said they prefer reading print books, 16% said they prefer reading ebooks, and only 8% said they prefer listening to audiobooks. 11% said they had no preference. Readers of all types still prefer print. About 50% of ebook and audiobook listeners still prefer print. Ebook readers prefer ebooks, but are much more likely to also prefer audiobooks than are print readers. Audiobook listeners, interestingly enough, prefer all other formats over audiobooks, but they also really like ebooks, and that probably shouldn't come as a big surprise. As people switch to the digital formats, that's how they consume their material. When we look at this by age, it's a little bit different. So what I've done here is taken those same preferences for print, e, and audio and broken them down by different age groups that you can see down the rows there. So 18 to 29, 30 to 44, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So 74% of 18 to 29-year-olds prefer print books, 13% prefer ebook, and only 7% prefer audio. So once again, everyone prefers print, as you can see here. 18 to 29% and 55 and over prefer print more than the kind of middle cohorts. The middle cohorts prefer ebooks and audiobooks more than the others. Almost 100% of 18 to 29-year-olds read print. Remember that? The highest, but everyone reads print fairly highly. 21% of the 45 to 54-year-olds read ebooks, the highest. 11% of 30 to 44-year-olds listen to audiobooks, and that's the highest group for those. And then there's some missing percentages here, and they're for the none. They don't prefer any, as you saw in the previous slide. So how do they discover these books that they read and prefer? Well, so we asked people to check the top 3. Consistently, year over year, the top way that people find the books that they read is by word of mouth. And then by public library, and then online book retailers, social media general retailer, bestsellers and awards, or online media are tied. Interestingly, the public library is the same percentage across all formats. So when we break this down by ebook and audiobook and print, about 39% of people say they 29% of people discover their book from the public library. Physical stores are most important for print, and that should probably make sense. Social media is very important for audiobook discovery. We get a very high incident rates there. So where do these readers acquire the books that they read? Well, most readers acquire their books that they read from the library, and that probably shouldn't come as a big surprise. And so what I've done here is I've broken down the different kind of channels or the acquisition channels by the formats. So roughly 30%, just under 30% of books, as I mentioned before, across all the formats are acquired from the library. And then ebooks are acquired from the library and from online retailers and from free online, whereas audiobooks are mostly from the library, but then they come from online retailers, free online, and subscription. We do give an option for illegal online, and some Canadians, being the honest people that they are, tell us that they download ebooks and audiobooks, or they get their ebooks and their audiobooks from illegal online sites, and those are primarily torrent sites or file sharing sites. The free online sites, which are also quite important for the digital formats, are public domain sites that share public domain titles. So we also asked readers this year, thinking about the books you read last year, select the type of books you read from the following list. And so the list was quite long, and I just picked the top 4 here. Almost half, 45% of people said that the books that they read were made into movies or TVs, and we see that in sales data as well, that movie tie-ins, media tie-ins are hugely important to sales, but they're also hugely important to reading. And then the number 2 reason that people, or the number 2 format of books or genre of books that people said they read were by and about Canadians and locals, and that was about 30% of our respondents said that. And then comics or graphic novels, which are having a bit of a boon over the last few years, and we'll touch on a bit more. Books in a language other than English. There are a fair number of books that people read in languages outside of English. Obviously, French is huge, but there are other languages too. So that's a kind of a top level view of our reading data, of our leisure data. We will be making a full report available for free a little bit later this spring, digging into this reading data in a lot more detail. We'll also be publishing to our blog and into our other media channels. So stay tuned for that. It should be very interesting. So I'm going to jump over now and look at sales for the last year, 2019, and what the sales from our sales data service. Now, sales data, just a reminder, is our physical book tracking service. So it tracks sales of physical books only. It doesn't track digital books at this time. So the top line number, the green number there, is 1.1 billion. We tracked sales of about $1.128 billion in the trade market in 2019. And that's physical book sales in the trade market primarily. We don't track educational sales in this service. The blue number is from our sister organization in Quebec, and they charted about $148 million in French language sales. Similarly, that's the trade market. Now, there's some differences here. The top level number in green for English language, we figure we chart about 85% of physical book trade sales, whereas the blue number for the Quebec market, their service is a little bit different, and they chart less of the full market there, so it's about 55 to 60%. Modeling these numbers up, if we combine them, the trade market in Canada for Canadian sales for physical books is about 1.3 or 1.4 billion dollars, maybe as high as 1.5 billion. And again, that doesn't include digital, so we have to add digital on top of that, which I'm not going to do quite yet. So how does this look by subject? Well, I've shared this before. Nonfiction, juvenile, and fiction is how our BISAC top-level subject categories break down. Juvenile, in this case, also includes YA. I just lumped them together. So about 40% of the market is juvenile, 34% is nonfiction, and 24% is fiction. The little sliver of 2% is non-classified items. And this is by units. When we look at it by dollars, it's quite different. Nonfiction is 45% of the dollars that are spent, fiction is 25%, and juvenile is 29%. So how does that look over time? Because we do chart this over time. So what you're seeing here is the last 10 years of sales data tracking by top-level subject category. So you can see back in 2010 that most of the top-level subject categories were pretty even, around 30%, and then through 2012 they were kind of even, and then we see this kind of spreading of the market. So a few things have happened. One is that a lot more books have been published, or a lot more big hits have been published into the YA juvenile category. So that's the light green, and that's obviously lifted that. But one of the big changes too is that we've seen a lot of digital publishing. And remember, we're only tracking physical book sales here, and the digital publishing has really made a difference to fiction categories. So in 2009, December of 2009, Kobo launched in Canada. and in November of 2009, Kindle launched, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that from that point on, a lot of the fiction reading has moved to digital, and we're not charting here. So that's why we're seeing that trend line go down. Also, some of those fiction books have just been published into juvenile. These are the bestsellers for the Canadian market in 2019. Only 4 were published in 2019, although some of the older ones were published at the end of 2018. 4 were fiction and 3 were juvenile titles. And when we look at Canadian bestsellers, so these are books authored by Canadians. We can have a look. Margaret Atwood did very well last year. And cookbooks did quite well as well. And then Love You Forever, which is number 7 last year, is often in the top 10 for Canada. And in fact, it's the number 2 bestseller in Canada over the last Canadian authored book in Canada over the last 15 years. Continues to sell extremely well. When we compare top level subject categories comparing 2018 to 2019, the whole market was down about 1% in our all aggregate, with fiction books being down 5% and nonfiction and juvenile being up slightly or just flat. So this is units sales in comparison. And we have to take that 0.8 down with a bit of a grain of salt because we did add some new retailers in the market, and I'll touch on that briefly. So what categories saw the strongest lift in year-over-year sales? So in nonfiction, the 3 large categories that saw the greatest lift in sales were social science, body, mind, and spirit, and true crime. Social science saw a lift year-over-year in unit sales of 20%. Body, mind, and spirit saw a lift of 8%, and true crime saw a lift of 5%. So I've shown some covers here of the titles in those categories that may have made a big difference, but in often cases it's not just a single title. In social science, for instance, the Malcolm Gladwell did very well, but there was the Melinda Gates and the Tanya Talaga book also did very well. Body, Mind, and Spirit was spread across a wide range of titles. And true crime, we've seen a lift, continued lift over the last few years of stuff being published into that category. So obviously, Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow did very well, but there was books by John Grisham and James Patterson published into that subject category, and The Billionaire Murders was another huge title published into true crime. But most of these categories we've seen continued lifts year over year for the last few years. Just off the list and not appearing here was comics and graphic novels, which we've heard a lot about in our market and in other markets. In the fiction categories that saw the greatest lift was historical fiction, horror, and dystopian. Dystopian is a fairly new category. It saw year-over-year growth of 67%, and that's primarily because Margaret Atwood's The Testaments is in that subject category. Horror saw an 18% year-over-year lift, and historical fiction saw a 10% year-over-year lift. Again, titles moving from subject category to subject category year-over-year can make a difference here. Or when we add new subject categories, like dystopian fiction, which is a relatively new category, it can change the makeup of the market. We look at formats over time. So what this is physical formats over time from our sales data service. So paperback, the dark green line at the very, very top is actually a combination of the 2 other lines, which are trade paperback, the other 2 green lines, which are trade paperback and mass market, with hardcover being the reddish pink line in the middle. So you can see not a lot of change here, although the mass market category is declining quite significantly year over year. You can see in the last 10 years, it's gone down by more than half of its sales. So some of that is obviously that some of those titles are moving to digital, because a lot of it genre fiction was published in the mass market category, but also a lot of those books are now being released as trade paperbacks in the Canadian marketplace for a lot of different reasons. Just off that list, using a completely different y-axis, is the physical audiobook sales. And we've never charted a lot of physical audiobook sales from the retailers that report to us, but you can see in the last 10 years, again, we have seen a fairly significant decline in that subject category. And obviously it's digital audiobook that has eaten away at that format particularly. And looking again back at our formats over time, and this is from our consumer panel, not from our sales data panel. You can see that blue line at the bottom is the audiobook panel, and it's been growing steadily, as we've talked about, and we'll touch on it in a little further along. But we've seen it's now 5% of the unit sales, and year over year that was almost a 35% increase. So it continues to grow significantly. Looking just for reference at the US book market, this is from NPD BookScan, which charts POS sales in the US market. We can see a similar declines to the Canadian market, but maybe a little bit different. There were no big Trump books published in 2019 in the US market, so adult nonfiction saw a bit of a decline because of that. But it was offset by sales of Becoming by Michelle Obama, which sold well over 1 million copies in the US. Self-help was up significantly, also in the nonfiction category, so that helped offset the non-Trump stuff. Where the Crawdads Sing, which also was one of the best sellers in Canada in 2019, sold almost 2 million copies in the US in the fiction category. Graphic novels were up 16% year over year. And when we look down in the lower part of this table, we can see the formats of the books sold, again, physical formats. And you can see the similar decline to physical audiobooks, which I mentioned in the Canadian market. Board books and hardcovers were the only two formats to post unit gains over 2018, and those increases were modest. The most troubling figure was for mass market paperbacks, again, similar to the Canadian market, where unit sales tumbled 15%. Sales of mass market paperbacks have been steadily declining for years, but the downward trend looked like it was easing a bit in 2018 when units fell only 6.1% compared to 2018. The return to double digits decline in 2019 suggests the format still faces challenges. And that's from NPD BookScan. Just to put it in context, I've compared the top-level BISAC subject categories by the US market and the Canadian market, and you can see there's definitely similarities between the two markets, a little bit different. We saw a much larger decline in fiction year over year, and then we saw increases in nonfiction and juvenile, whereas the US market saw slight declines in those categories. Overall, the US market saw a decline in units of about 1.3%, according to NPD BookScan. So similar behavior in both markets. I did mention that we are continually adding new retailers into our all markets, so it sometimes can be hard to measure increases and decreases. We do have separate statistical groups that we can use for doing that. When we look at these groups, it looks like the Canadian market was down in 2019 about 3% from 2018 in units sold, but that's a bit of a guesstimate and should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. So on that note, I'm going to switch back to our research and education, slip away from sales data and look at our consumer survey data again. And so this is again us surveying online Canadians, adults, about their book purchasing, book awareness, and book use. And the top line from that is that what we're seeing here is the number of purchases done in our panel from physical stores or online stores. So this is by quarter for the last 5 years, last 20 quarters or so. And this is all formats, so it includes both digital and physical. And we can see back at the start near the y-axis there in 2015 that physical stores were consistently ahead of online, but in our panel over time we've steadily seen online increasing. It's been increasing when we combine all the formats by about 2% a year in purchasing, and now we're seeing the blue line, which is online purchasing, be steadily above the physical book purchasing. And what's interesting is that in Q4 of each year, we obviously see the online decrease and the physical store go up a little bit because people are purchasing gifts, and so they go into stores to purchase physical gifts. But this year, for the first time in Q4, we actually saw online slip above physical books. It was very, very close in numbers, but that's an interesting thing to watch, and we'll have to see how that plays out over the next while. When we pull out the digital books and just look at physical books, this is done by year over the last few years, with the blue being online purchases of physical books and the yellowish orange being in-store purchases of physical books. We can see similar behavior. So other than this last year where it ticked down a tiny bit, but within the margin of error, we've seen online purchases for physical books increase from 34% to around 40%, where we've seen physical store sales of physical books decline from around 60% to 55%. So this is a behavior we're hearing not just in books, but across lots and lots of product categories, where a lot of shopping has been shifting to online, and that shouldn't come as a huge surprise. There's a lot going on in this graph, but what I've done here is a similar year-over-year breakdown for the last 5 years. We've broken down book sales by channel, by high-level channel. So you can see the similar behavior. The green bar for the last few years, again, is that increase in online sales from 35 to kind of 40%. Chain is the pink. Chain and indie, pink and orange, or chain and bookstore, have been staying pretty steady. Discount moves up and down a little bit. Ebook and audio has been pretty steady, and mobile app has been pretty steady. We do see some correlation perhaps between online and discount and general, where similar numbers they can correspond to one another. Indies and chains are pretty much holding their own, right around 25% for the chains and around 9% for the indie bookstores. And that's been very consistent over the last few years. One of the things we started charting in the last few years is loyalty programs. And so what we're interested here is specifically in book buying loyalty programs. So 65% of book buyers are in one of these programs, one of the ones on the screen here, and 70% of all book purchases are made by a book buyer in one of these programs in our panel. And of note here is the huge growth in the Amazon Prime numbers. Even in just the last 3 years, we've grown from 13% of book buyers saying they were in an Amazon Prime program to almost 30%. And that's quite a change. It's something we're watching quite closely. So where do people acquire their print books? This is from book buyers, and then in the last 12 months, 58% of book buyers said that they bought a new print book, 29% said they bought a used book, 29% said they received as a gift, and about 25% of people said that they borrowed a print book from the library in the last 12 months. Secondhand books also chart here, and they're just below, and they're about 20%. I'm going to switch out of the physical book realm for a few minutes and just touch on our ebooks. So we don't collect POS data, as I mentioned, or point of sale data on digital sales, but we do survey on digital sales. And so this will be a summary from our consumer panel again. So top level data. In the last year, 21% of respondents told us that they read an ebook. 33% of buyers read an ebook. The difference here is that the 21% of respondents is just the general population, and the buyers are those particularly of people who bought a book in the last year. This is similar to our leisure data, where we ask about reading. About 35 to 50% of 35% of readers read a ebook last year. So where do they discover those books? We asked them to list the 3 primary ways that they discover their ebooks. Again, word of mouth is the most important way across all formats for book discovery, but also public libraries, online book retailers and bookstores, social media, online media, bestsellers or awards, and general retailers. So even bookstores are still important for an ebook discovery. Where do they acquire those books? So again, this is from our readers. About 34% acquire them from an online ebook retailer. About 31% discover them from a public library, acquire them from a public library, and about 20% acquire them from a free online site. Again, that is probably public domain, but it could be illegal torrent sites as well. And what devices do they use to read them on? Well, 36% of people read on a tablet, 23% on a smartphone, 20% on an e-reader, and 19% on a computer. We've seen strong growth in smartphones over the last few years and a little bit of a decline in e-readers, although it's been steady for the last couple years. The apps that they use to read on, the number 1 app is Kindle, the number 2 is Kobo, and the number 3 is just in the browser. So let's switch away from reading ebooks and talk a little bit about buying ebooks. So 10% in the last year, 10% of respondents bought an ebook, and that's of the general population again, and 23% of buyers bought an ebook. And just to put that in relation to print, 34% of respondents bought a print book, and 57% of buyers bought a print book. So it's a little bit lower than the print numbers, but consistent. The price they paid for those ebooks on average was $10.62. I have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because it's a fairly small sample size here. Not everyone gives us the prices they paid, but it seems to be consistent with what we're seeing elsewhere. Around $10 is the price for a trade ebook on average. The list price of those books is $17.80. So this is what they're paying, and then the list price is $17.80. People are telling us that they still feel that at the price they're paying, $10.62, that they're getting good value on the ebooks that they're reading or purchasing. 50% of those purchases were made in some kind of sale or discount program. Higher, and that's higher for ebooks are higher in that regard than any other format. More people buy ebooks in some kind of sale or discount program than any other format. So let's switch over to audiobooks for a moment. There's been a lot of attention given to audiobooks over the last couple of years here in Canada and around the world because it's the largest growing format. It's the format that we're seeing the greatest growth year over year. And this is a Google Trends graph for searches over the last 15 years for the term audiobook. And you can see over the last 10 years, a pretty big growth in the number of searches on that. And so if we were to draw a trend line here, it would definitely be trending up. And we're hearing that and seeing that in all of our data as well. So it's something we want to pay attention to because consumers are paying attention to it, or book readers are paying it, or listeners are paying attention to it. So similarly, in the last year, 10% of respondents of the general population listened to an audiobook, and 17% of book buyers listened to an audiobook. And that's up over the year before and continues to go up every year. So we'll just focus on reading audiobooks. This was mostly surveyed at the beginning of 2019, but we have some updated data as well. So remember again that the reading data that we have, 96% of people said they read a print book, 61% read an ebook, but still almost half said they listened to an audiobook. And that's up significantly year over year. The previous year when we asked the same question, 35% of people told us that they listened to an audiobook. So it's up almost 15% year over year, but it is again from a different survey group. And how do they discover those audiobooks? Again, they were supposed to rank the top 3. Again, word of mouth is the consistent one across all formats. The public library is hugely important for audiobooks, both discovery and acquisition, bookstores, online book retailers, social media, online media, bestsellers or awards, and general retailers. All of these are important. And again, what devices do they use to listen to those audiobooks? The number 1 is smartphone. The number 2 is tablet. The number 3 is computer. And now we've started to get some people saying on their car, obviously. So we do ask about smart speakers, and they're just off the list here at about 6%. We've seen a large growth in the last 4 or 5 years, obviously, in smartphone listening as more people get those apps and decide to consume their audiobooks in that fashion. The number 1 apps for listening to audiobooks, the number 1 is YouTube, surprisingly enough. Number 2 is Kindle. Number 3 is Audible. And number 4 is Kobo. Where do they get the audiobooks that they're listening to? The number 1 way is from the public library. Number 2 is from an online retailer. 20% of people say that they get them from an online retailer. And then 18% said they get them from a free internet site. So obviously online retailer includes subscription in this case. Public library is hugely important. It's leaps and bounds ahead of everywhere else that people acquire audiobooks. Free is the second choice for all ages. And if we add subscription to online, it equals the library one at 30%. So subscription would just be off the bottom here at 11%. Just speaking of libraries a little bit more, Overdrive provided to, I don't have the 2019 numbers yet, but Overdrive provided to us the audiobook checkouts year over year, and that's the orange bar graph you're seeing here. And you can see the huge growth in audiobook checkouts, and this is for Canadian public libraries. It's around a 25 to 30% year over year growth over the last few years. And this is only one of the digital lending platforms. There could be, we don't have numbers for Hoopla or Cloud Library, but they would I assume, be showing similar growth. And at the bottom, the little table at the bottom, it was provided by Toronto Public Library. Thank you, Toronto Public Library. And this is their checkouts year over year for 2018 and 2019. So books saw a 1% growth year over year in checkouts. Ebooks saw a 12% growth from 4.3 million to almost 5 million. And e-audiobooks, so not physical audio, but digital audio, saw a growth of almost 30%. 1.2%, sorry, 1.2 million to 1.6 million. And we're hearing this from public libraries all across the country and in North America generally, that this huge growth in the digital formats at their libraries, and specifically in the e-audio. So let's switch over now to just buying audiobooks. So 4% of respondents bought an audiobook, that's the general population again, and 10% of buyers bought an audiobook. So the price they paid for those books, again, take this with a bit of a grain of salt. On average, they told us that they paid $14 for those audiobooks, for the ones they purchased anyway. And that seems to be pretty equal to a monthly subscription fee, which in Canada ranges kind of around $10 to $14 in that range, depending on who you're subscribing from. But also if you're buying, some books are $14 on average, or you get them discounted down to $14. But the average list price for those same books that were purchased was $35. So subscription is playing a huge role here. And when we kind of break this down, 26% of the purchases in our panel came from a subscription service, and 45% were bought at full price. And take that with a bit of a grain of salt. 88% of respondents thought audiobooks were good or excellent value at the price they paid, and that was higher than both print and ebooks. So people really do think that either for their subscription fee or for the price that they're paying for the audiobooks they're buying, that they get excellent or great value for those books, and that's probably a good thing. That's it for audiobooks for now, but once again, similar to our leisure and reading data, we will be having an audiobook study coming out later this spring or early in the summer, focused on audiobook usage and readings, particularly in Canada. And we've done the data collection for that already, and we're just putting the report together now. So stay tuned for that report, and it'll be released for free. Just want to touch really briefly on libraries to sum things up here, because we've been doing a lot of focus on libraries. So top level number, just about a quarter, or 27% of Canadians told us that they acquired a book in any format from the library in the last 12 months. And that's surveying 12,000 adult English-speaking Canadians again. 21% said they got a print book, 7% said they got an ebook, and 5% said they got an audiobook. And that's from the general population. 20% of respondents said they visited a library for some other purpose than borrowing a book in the last 12 months. You may have seen us release this data in our buy-borrow study, but I just thought I'd recirculate it here. So what you're seeing here is a Venn diagram of our buyers from our consumer study and our borrowers, our book borrowers, or library users from our book study. And what we're trying to show here is that there's an overlap in buyers and borrowers, and that people who buy books also borrow books, and conversely, people who borrow books are also buying books. So what you're seeing is the middle group there, borrow buyers, or those are the people who said they both bought a book in the last year and or borrowed a book in the last year. And what we're trying to show here is that book buyers and book borrowers also buy books. They're not just using the library, they're also purchasing books. And when we break down those kind of visits, what you can see here is the average number of purchases per month for book buyers, and then the number of times that those people visited the library in that period as well. So, in a month. The top group is never, and those people who don't visit the library or didn't visit the library in that month bought on average 2.6 books a month. Those who visited the library 1 to 4 times bought 2.7 books a month, et cetera, as we work our way up. Looking at all buyers and their purchases in the last month, we found that buyers bought on average of 2.8 books a month. Borrowers, those who both used the library and purchased a book in a month, bought 3 books a month. Buyers who visited the library at least once in the last month bought an average of 3 books. Buyers who did not use the library, that never group, as you can see here, bought 2.6 books. So those who use the library bought almost a half a book more per month than those who don't. What were they borrowing? So this comes from our library data project, and Hannah, who's doing another Tech Forum online presentation on our library data project, you can tune into her presentation by following the links. We'll give you a lot more information on how that project works. But generally what we're doing is we're capturing circulation data from public libraries, and we started this about halfway through 2019, so it's a half a year. And these were the top lent books or loaned books from the public libraries in our panel in the last kind of 6 months of 2019. And it's very dominated by juvenile titles, but you can also see it corresponds a little bit to our sales data. And we look at Canadian authored books lent from the public libraries. Here are the top 4 most loaned or lent Canadian authored books from public libraries in the last 6 months of 2019. The Marrow Thieves, The Hidden Life of Trees, Small Game Hunting, and Ducks, Newburyport. We charted about 9 million loans last year in the last 6 months of 2019. And it's a fairly good indication of what's being lent across the country. We can also compare by BISAC subject category what's being lent in our libraries and what's being purchased. So the green bars here are what's being purchased at retail, and the purple bars are what's being lent from the public libraries. So you can see that the public libraries are very much dominated by juvenile lending, and the sales data is a little more dominated by nonfiction, or what people are buying at the stores is nonfiction. This is something we'll watch again. The library data is just 6 months, where the green sales data is for 12 months. And lots more of this is coming from our library data project. So just in summary, we have a lot of data, as you can see. I've shown a lot of charts. We will make this presentation available via SlideShare too. Happy to take questions via email or on social. You can hit us up at all of our different channels, and we'll do our best to answer. As a summary to our Borrow, Buy, Read study, which came out in the summer of 2019, is available for free off our website. We also released late in 2019, towards Christmas, Reading Together, which was a study particularly about book clubs in Canada, which combined some ad hoc surveying we did around book clubs and survey and data from our consumer panel. We saw a huge growth in the number of Canadians participating in book clubs in 2019, and so we wanted to focus a little more attention on that. And that's a purchase study, but you can get that off our website following the link below. And I've mentioned already some of these, but some stuff we have coming up shortly, early in 2019 or in the next few months. We have the Canadian book market, which will be released in the next week or two, and that's our focus on sales in the Canadian book market in 2019, looking at the top level subject categories and top level numbers, and that's available off our website. We will have our leisure and reading study available for free off our website in the next few months. We're also working on a state of publishing study, more on that in a second. And we also have our audiobook listening study updated. We've done that every 2 years. The last one was done in 2018, and we'll be updating that for 2020, and that'll be available off our website too. Speaking of the state of publishing survey, if you work for a publisher or you know some publishers, we are surveying publishers right now on the state of their business. It's an interesting time to do that. We are gathering that information, and we will make it available back to the market later this year. You can follow the links below to get more information. We're asking business operations, staffing, what they're doing with workflow and things like that, so that we can get some benchmarking that we can use for the rest of the industry. So we urge people to fill out that study as soon as they possibly can, and we'll make the results available later this year. And that, folks, is it. Thank you very much for tuning in to Tech Forum Online. Hope this format works for you. Again, it's been an interesting time, and we really appreciate your attention. If you want to reach out about clarification on any of this data, or you have questions for our research team, you can reach me at ngenner@booknetcanada.ca. Please follow our newsletter or follow us on social, and we'll be updating stats there. And be releasing more and more content from our Tech Forum 2020. Also, as mentioned at the start, we will be doing summaries of the changes in the marketplace that we're seeing data-wise and from talking to consumers related to the COVID-19 issues that are going on right now. Please stay tuned for more of that. Stay safe and keep reading.